Hi everybody, again this is Brian in the Actec shop, Nome. We spent a little time talking about safety, again how amazingly important it is to be safe in the shop. Next we're going to get into talking about the tools and the measuring tools that are used to help rebuild the engines. Again, it doesn't make sense to rebuild an engine with wore out parts, so we're going to get into that a little bit too. People ask me, again I have my own business repairing snow machines and four-wheelers and all. What is the most important tool in my tool chest? Right here. Because if you think about it, at site, and you have machines that aren't running, I would venture to say that it's probably an electrical issue. So, and we'll get more into this later, but this tool here is awesome. When I first got talking about electrons, I'm like, I don't like them because I can't see them. This can see them. The main thing that this will measure, again, it's called a multimeter. And the reason it's called multimeter is because it'll read multiple things. But this thing here, the main three things that it will measure are voltage, current, and resistance. And when you're testing components, this takes the guesswork out of it. In other words, if you think your regulator is bad or rectifier is bad, this will tell you for sure if it's bad. And that's awesome because then you're not spending a bunch of money on a bunch of parts that you really don't need. Voltage. And then the little horseshoe, that is the resistance. And actually we'll measure for diodes. In other words, one thing that's really important in some of the circuits is that the electrons are only flowing in one direction. So this will test a component that's called a diode and tell you whether the electrons are only flowing in that one direction. And that has to do with the rectifiers. In those rectifiers, what force they basically turn the AC current into DC current, and then also into what are called amps into current. Okay, so that the current is how many electrons are flowing, and the voltage is like pressure, voltage electron pressure. It's kind of cool. You can think about the electrical circuits as water, a water system, and I'll get into that a little more later. Okay, I always tell people if you're in the shop and you're not set up with air, you're just playing. Because these tools make what you're trying to get accomplished in the shop much faster. You're so much more efficient, it's amazing. This is called an impact. Okay, this happened to be made by AirCat. So there's a connector that hooks onto here and normally supplies about 100 PSI. And it will go forward and reverse, and it even has stages. In other words, you can have it be in reverse, in one, which means it's pretty gentle. Then 2 is tougher, and 3 is snap things off. So these things, you got to be careful with them. Again, make sure you're wearing your eye protection and all, because it'll snap things off. They're that strong. This thing is probably like 1,000 foot-pounds. It's serious, okay? And all the other different tools, we're just going to show a few. Here's a grinder, a die grinder. In other words, you put a wheel on here, an abrasive wheel for cutting things, and notice the safety guard on it. And here is another angle. This is called an angle grinder, and you notice a little carbide tip in it, a little bit in it for cutting metal, plastic, wood. I mean, it'll cut basically almost anything. It's really, really hard. And there are other things too. There are air chisels. You can use the nozzle to clean things off, but be real careful of that so you don't get it in your eyes. Lots of different things. You can buy a kit from, say, Northern Tool that has a bunch of these in it for like 150 bucks. The important thing, the really important thing, is when you're using these tools is every time you go to use it, put 4 drops of air tool oil in this hole. They'll work for years and years and years, but you got to take care of them. It's like anything. You can't have the metal rubbing on metal. Has to do with this, has to do with your engine, I mean your suspension. Don't have the metal, don't allow the metal to rub on the metal. That's bad, real bad. This happens to be the New-Way cutter for redoing the seats, the valve seats. So again, there's a bunch of different tools that are kind of specialty tools. This one happens to be really expensive. This is like a $400 kit. You can buy other brands that aren't as expensive, but this is a really good brand. Your standard socket and wrench set. And again, one of the things that makes this really slick, really useful is this right here. I mean, this is amazing. This is so useful. All the different bits, Phillips, you know, the slot, Torx, all kinds of different things. The wrenches, the ratchets, be careful with your ratchets. Don't overdo your ratchets. You don't want to break the little pieces inside here that keep it from ratcheting. So if you've got something that's really tight, don't use a ratchet, use something different. Okay? You use a regular wrench. It's going to tell you whether it's metric or standard. So again, if you're working on a Skidoo is made in Canada, and the engine's actually made in Austria. All the fasteners on that machine are metric. If you have an Arctic Cat or an Polaris, on them the engines are metric and the chassis are standard or imperial SAE. So you need to have both, like both sets. I actually have a kit at home that I've had for many years. It's called Metrinch. It's really cool because it actually works on both. It's designed to work on both. It looks really different. The ends of the sockets, the end of the wrenches look really different. And it's an incredible set and it's very tough. I'm rather picky. I have had this set for over 20 years and it's got thousands of miles on it in a sled out in the country. Everything in its original, which is incredible. The ratchet's even original. I haven't even broke the ratchet yet, the inside of the ratchet. So I'm impressed. It pays to buy quality tools. But it doesn't hurt to have a set of tools around like wrenches and all that are maybe not Snap-on or Craftsman, because just the other day we're trying to get to working on the carburetors on my old Summit, and I'm trying to get the choke plunger out and the wrench was too long. So I took it in my shop, put it in a vise, and I cut it in half. But it wasn't one of my really good Craftsman, whatever. So I have some of the cheaper tools around. If I need to customize something, I just customize it, okay? Because again, they make new ones every day, right? Something else we'll get into later too is maybe your rig's not running because it doesn't have enough compression. So I'll show you later on how one of these work. And again, it doesn't pay to rebuild a worn out engine. So this happens to be what's called a micrometer. And there's like 3 different kinds. There is a micrometer that will measure accurately to within 1/1000th of an inch. There's a micrometer called a vernier micrometer that will measure accurately to the 10,000th of an inch. A lot of times when you see those really precise measurements is like when you're in the aviation. In other words, when you get these really, really close tolerances, okay? And there's a scale on them. I don't know if we'll get to that or not. There's a scale on them that you need to learn how to read. It's not too tough. This one happens to be metric. This one's millimeters, okay? And I got this from a friend of mine that says USSR. So this one's metric, but they come in again, metric and SAE or standard or imperial, again, fractions of an inch. Here's Cheaton. Again, these are actually, were bought to be sent out to site. This is a digital caliper. Again, it's so cool because get it to 0, and then right now it's in millimeters. So as I pull it back, it'll tell you the accuracy to within 100th of a millimeter. So if you think about that, a millimeter is about that much, right? Think about having that millimeter divided into 100 equal distances. That's pretty amazingly accurate, isn't it? And there's 3 ways to measure with this. You can measure in here, you can measure here, and you also can measure on the end of it. So this will work for depth, this will measure inside, and this will measure outside. Maybe I want to know inches. And this one's actually, this one actually will measure to the thousandths. Nice tool. Again, you're out trying to measure something, you're making sure your parts aren't wore out, but your battery goes dead. Make sure when you're done with this too that you turn it off, okay? This is the dial caliper, it's called. So pretty slick. In other words, once it's all the way closed, what you could do here then is turn the dial to get it to 0. You snug this up, okay? And then as it comes out, the lines on here, again, the carpenters took the inch and divided it in half, and then divided it in half again. So that's where you get halves, quarters, eighths. That's not how this works. On this, the inch is divided into 10 equal segments. That's just a little bit different, because on here, see later, it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and into 1. Then what happens is, say if I go like where I'm at now, it goes 1, 1, I'm past that 1, and I just read it off the dial. So it's 1.142. So it's pretty simple to use. Be gentle, be nice to these. These are delicate instruments. Don't force things. Okay, be gentle with them. Don't drop them. Don't be pushing real hard. No, you're gonna hurt it. You're gonna wreck it. Okay. Again, there's so many different tools that can be involved with this. This happens to be a, a spring compressor for taking the valves out of certain Briggs & Stratton series engines. What it does is it slips in, and then you turn this down and it compresses the spring, and then you can take the keepers off. So there are certain tools, like this one here is kind of a deal breaker. In other words, if you don't have this tool, how are you going to get those springs off of there? Again, the cool part about it is these tools will be sent to the site. They'll be with the engines and all free to use. So, because again, there are some that how are you going to get the thing apart unless you have the specialty tool? I just want to mention that. And here's one of the wrenches that really is important. This is called a torque wrench. In other words, it's very important to get the fasteners tightened to a certain tightness. There's the big bolts that hold the head on the top of the motor. Those fasteners need to be tightened to a very specific tightness, because you don't want this one tight, this one kind of loose, because remember that engine, when it starts up and starts running, when it heats up, it expands. So you don't want this bolt to be pulling down real hard and this one, not as much. That's how things get cracked and warped and that kind of stuff. And again, this is really cool because the way these guys work is put it on the fastener and you pull it and you pull it and you pull it, and then all of a sudden it'll go click, and then you stop. Then you know it's at a certain either foot pounds is the torque, or inch pounds. And be real careful of those, because I had a student years ago that was tightening the fasteners on one of these bolts on the engine, and he broke like 3 of them. I'm like, show me what you're doing. Well, what he had done is he took a rather large one, I think it was like a 1/2-inch drive, and he set it to foot pounds instead of inch pounds. So he was trying to tighten it 12 times tighter than it was supposed to be. And there's also the metric on here too, the Newton meters. Where do you find that information? Is right in the manual, and do not rely on your memory. Go to the manual, look it up. Every time you do it, go to the manual and look it up. Because if you're going to fix something for somebody and they come in, they ought to ask you, well, how tight did you tighten those? Don't tell them, show them in the book. That's the right way to do it. Here's another one of those. Again, a few examples. These are called feeler gauges. In other words, when you're setting the valves, the end of the valves have to have a little bit of a gap on them so that the oil can get between the tappet and the valve. The exhaust valve has more than the intake valve, because the exhaust valve is what's dealing with all the heat. So as it gets hot, it gets longer. So you need to have more of a clearance there than you do on the intake valve, because the intake valve is bringing in a lot of times this really cold air, so it's not affected so bad. So these are called feeler gauges, and they're in metric and imperial and standard, and there's certain thicknesses. So that'll let you gap your spark plug and set your valve clearances. When you put the electronics back together on the engine, the pickup coil needs to be a real precise distance from the magnet when the magnet spins. That's what these guys are for. Again, this is one of those too that's kind of tough to do without. Some of the old boys will say, oh, just use they tear the top off of their book of matches and use that, because it was actually amazingly consistent and worked. This is a tap and die set, and it's metric and standard. These are the taps, and these are the dies. And kind of cool here, they even have a really neat tool inside here. This happens to be the metric one. In other words, the way they do it with metric threads is when it makes a complete turn, how far did the nut travel? The way they do it with that is, like one of the real common ones is a 6 millimeter by 1. That means the diameter of the fastener is 6 millimeters. In every turn, that the nut part of it would travel 1 millimeter. And it goes all the way from like a 1/2 millimeter up to 3 millimeters. I mean, some of them can get really big. See how big the teeth are on that one? Again, this is a thread gauge. This can tell you what the pitch is. They call it the pitch. Okay. So again, a little bit of an introduction to some of the different tools. There's lots of different tools that are used, and again, some of them are very crucial with the disassembly and the reassembly process. So, and we'll get into a little more of that later too.